Okay, well, thank you for having me. Today, I'm going to talk about a research group that I helped form in 2016, a pedagogical experiment we conducted with the support of the Landscape Architecture Foundation Canada in the winter of 2022, and 10 lessons about teaching optimism in landscape architecture design studios that I extrapolated by reading course syllabi, reviewing student work, and speaking with studio leaders. Teaching and learning landscape architecture in Canada is closely tied to the profession. The Canadian Society of Landscape Architects recognizes 7 professional university programs. Each school undergoes a rigorous self-evaluation and peer review accreditation process with the purpose of keeping professional standards and pedagogy aligned across the country. Students learning at these accredited schools should gain the skills to thoughtfully design space that is reflective of natural and cultural processes, and that is considerate of the site's many users at a standard that prepares them for professional practice. Given the country's physical and cultural landscape variations, the accreditation body encourages each school to build a unique program that aligns with the profession's general values. The profession's strong core values are visible in the curriculum, yet as Douglas Patterson concluded in his 1995 article, Landscape Architecture Research in Canada, Developing a Certain Future in Uncertain Times, there is a large gap in the dissemination of academic research to professionals. Patterson found that instructors developed the basis for their research in studio classes, but few peer review publications followed. In 2011, Robert Brown and Robert Corey published Evidence-Based Landscape Architecture, The Maturing of the Profession, that acknowledged a similar yet different gap that few peer review publications exist disseminating innovative built work. As a result, instructors lacked content in the form of Canadian case studies that could be used in the classroom. To address these shortcomings in communications across teaching, practice, and research, 7 researchers came together in 2016 to form the Landterre Design Research Network. In early 2019, the research group proposed a joint studio experiment centered around a relatively open theme of abandoned space. The experiment, like the rest of life, was jarred by the complete shutdown brought on by COVID-19. And while we abandoned the research side of the experiment, the teaching and learning experience reported by the instructors and the students alike was very positive. They wanted a window into other classrooms. As a result, we decided to try again in 2022 with a new theme, optimism reflecting a post-COVID emergence. We moved ahead with the same goals to understand better where teaching and learning around a common theme intersect at different schools, and if teaching influences our research or vice versa. We created an open brief that accounted for the different program needs and students' abilities. I asked instructors to share their course syllabi and detailed site descriptions. Overall, we had 95 students at 7 institutions in 9 different classrooms, guided by a combination of 17 professors, instructors, and professional landscape architects. And as you can see in the diagram, students prepared designs for 21 different sites, ranging in scale from 9,000 square meters to something like 54 square kilometers in the case of Churchill, Manitoba. My review of the site descriptions found that all 9 studio sites dedicated themselves to an exploration of public space for public good without discriminating among user groups. Landscape architects are modeling what cultural critic Henry Giraud calls educated hope in his book, The Abandoned Generation, Democracy Beyond a Culture of Fear, by valorizing public space over private, public good over commercial goods, and questioning existing structures. As part of the brief, I asked instructors to co-create a reading list related to hope and optimism. One article stood out. It's a 2020 paper by environmental historian Graham Wynne called Framing an Ecology of Hope. To put perspective on the present, Wynne reflects on the careers and contributions of 2 20th century Canadian critical thinkers, ecologist Pierre Dansereau and political theorist C.B. Macpherson. Dansereau and Macpherson experienced the hardships of the Great Depression, the rise of consumer society in post-war America, and the civic dis-ease of the 1960s, which Wynne associates to contemporary challenges like COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Truth and Reconciliation Act, and climate change. Moreover, Wynne uses these 2 theorists to reinforce that there's a much needed balance between natural and social sciences, which are foundational to understanding and designing space in landscape architecture. On the ecological side, Donchereau studied the interconnectedness of ecological systems to understand how different plant communities work together. On the social sciences side, McPherson critiqued capitalist society, private property, and human communities. While landscape ecology is traditionally taught through readings, labs, and case studies and site visits, learning about human communities is often, but not always, experienced firsthand through studio projects. To keep a balance between natural and social sciences, we teach our students the ABCs of site analysis. So how to read the abiotic, biotic, and cultural aspects of a site. We insist that they present their findings in a classroom setting. The studio experiment performed in the winter of 2022 was the first in-person semester for most of the students. It was the first time that some of these students worked together in the studio setting, the first time they faced in-person reviews, and the first time that many of them met or engaged with public groups. In other words, the studio intersected on a global timeline of community rebuilding. And it's notable that when I went through Wynn's article and underlined all the words that I found to be optimistic and compared them with a list of keywords in the 9 core syllabi, that community is the word that repeated itself the most. The landscape community I'm referring to in this pedagogical experiment includes 3 undergraduate and 6 graduate level courses, 5 of which were taught to students in the early stages of their respective design programs. That's to say that more than half the instructors were teaching students the essential tools of design, various aspects of site analysis, and the meaning and organization of space and spatial relationships. In contrast, the remaining 4 studios were upper level classes where students were able to advance their visual communications and understanding of social and ecological systems more profoundly. All this to say that the student work I'm about to share comes from different levels of experience, and while I'm not comparing apples to oranges, there are several factors to consider when analyzing the results of the experiment. So in the time that remains, I'm going to describe the pedagogical tools that the professors used to keep students optimistic through the semester, and 10 lessons that I extracted through my analysis. At the University of Montreal, Professor Nicole Valois introduced optimism by assigning Wynn's reading. She asked the students in her preparatory MLA studio to reflect on what is beautiful, what historical traces are important in understanding a disturbed site, and what is neglected from popular narratives. By positioning her students in the framework of hope, Nicole's students were able to look beyond the active construction site in Montreal's Griffintown neighborhood to find inspiration for their projects. They were captivated by the history of the St. Lawrence River, the evolution of the Lachine Canal, and the now obsolete wharves in the historically working class and post-industrial part of the city. These students chose to celebrate the vitality of the river, the newfound interest in plant design by incorporating resilient species and water features in the design of a public park along the canal. Marcella Eaton, a professor at the University of Manitoba, uses Giraud and other cultural critics as she guides her students through a positioning and a worst case scenario exercise. Giraud speaks of hope in a context that, I quote, does not ignore the worst dimensions of human suffering, exploitation, and social relations. On contrary, it acknowledges the need to sustain the capacity to see the worst and offer more for our consideration, end quote. Early in the term, Marcy gets her students to produce a collage that represents a place. They must complete the exercise without doing much research. And in the end, they're positioning themselves relative to what they think they know about a place. In subsequent discussions, students are forced to either to consider their understanding and face potential biases they have about the community. Then, working back and forth between the studio and a GIS course, she has them map and write a report about everything that could possibly go wrong in a place before they have their first site visit. In 2022, the students explored the northern community of Churchill, Manitoba. Design projects included proposal for bettering a community, like a new port or outdoor walking trails that circumvented polar bear habitat, while connecting emergent future of a place facing imminent disruptions due to climate change, failing rural infrastructure, and everlasting traces of colonialism. The UBC studio was one of at least 4 that had chosen their site and written their brief before agreeing to join the Studio Problematique experiment. After reading the course description and speaking with the pair, I understood why Daniel Rower and Stephanie Bracconi agreed to participate. They framed their problematique in response to the impact on the mental health of citizens living in cities and the lack of accessibility to green spaces during the pandemic. The project required a proposal for a public space that was safe, accessible, and equitable for everyone. I found the studio site exploration and analysis exercises central to the course objectives. Daniel and Stephanie asked students to visit a public outdoor space and experience it with all of their senses: touch, taste, sound, smell, and sight. And I like this exercise because there's little room for a smartphone. As a result, the students describe the feeling of a wet leaf touching their pant leg, the sound of a soggy sneaker on the pavement, and the smell of compost. After 2 years online, these students were moving their bodies and reinvigorating their senses. At the University of Guelph, Assistant Professor Zana Madsen asked her students to consider the ways in which a former extraction site can become the site of optimistic proposals by engaging with local communities and broader social movements to achieve one of the following objectives: returning Indigenous land and supporting the land back movement, mitigating the impacts of climate change at a local scale, developing material reuse and non-extractive building practices, and strengthening and diversifying local economies. When I asked Anna what tools she used to inspire creativity in her work, she said assigning really optimistic and interesting precedents that have really pushed to make big differences in the landscape and produced great results is a way of seeing seeing beyond the possibilities of everyday landscapes. Like Wynne, who reflects on Dansereau and McPherson, Zana finds optimism and hope in the studio by reflecting on really great examples from the past that demonstrate a balance across natural processes and social movements. We can also find optimism by temporarily setting big problems aside or engaging with them one step or scale at a time. Fritz Van Loon, assistant professor at the University of Manitoba, set out to help his students understand scale in his advanced undergraduate studio. Students started by studying the provincial watershed and learning about catchment systems at a scale of about 1 to 10,000, which is challenging and daunting for many designers. Students studied the challenges of the water system, like flooding, pollution from agriculture, access to clean drinking water. And Fritz gave the students 1 hectare of land and challenged them to design a utopian community in north of Winnipeg. A community that was protected against flooding, was able to retain water and overcome periods of drought, and had the ability to purify water from agricultural areas in the neighborhood itself. To do this, he encouraged students to look at the hectare in one way at a time. First, they had to develop housing, then they needed to densify it, then they added biodiversity, and finally adding programming like parks and infrastructure. Fritz increased the complexity of the design one step at a time until the community designs achieved their utopian state. Dalhousie University senior lecturer Ed Versteeg grounded his studio in a timely and pressing problematique for the growing rural municipality of East Hants in central Nova Scotia. In the months leading up to the studio, a not-for-profit community group in Shubenacadie village with a population of about 2,000 donated a flood-prone parcel of land to the municipality in hopes of addressing and alleviating a shortage of public recreational space. In the years leading up to the pandemic, the once resource-related economy shifted to commercial, and first-time home buyers unable to afford Halifax's booming real estate market flocked to the area. The pandemic exacerbated the growth as people from across the country sought out rural lifestyles. Ed asked his final year Bachelor of Technology and Landscape Architecture students to design a project alongside representatives from the municipality. In addition to addressing the recurrent tidal floods and erosion along the banks, students were asked to critically assess the needs of the growing community. When asked what he would do differently next year, he said he would put a budget on it and cap that sky. In really ambitious studio projects, signs of optimism can be found in the political will and promise of funding for a project. The focus of the University of Toronto studio was on improving flood conditions in the urban environment through the design and use of natural infrastructure. Associate Professor Alyssa North and sessional lecturers Todd Douglas and Rui Felix used Smythe Park as their site of exploration. Students worked with members of the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority and staff from the City of Toronto to determine flood mitigation strategies and programmatic opportunities. Students had to demonstrate the feasibility of their project to the clients and prepare detailed drawings for the constructability of their designs. The students leveraged their previous studio experience and course knowledge to communicate optimism through their project proposals. Professor Enrica Del Ara and instructor Gordon Skelling asked their second-year master's students to prepare a master plan for two of Calgary's oldest neighborhoods, Ramsey and Inglewood. The adjacent communities are linked by their industrial path, yet physically separated by a railway line. So with an emphasis on hope, the studio leaders asked their students to prepare sensitive design to preserve and reinforce the sense of belonging by seizing new opportunities for positive change. The studio leaders returned to this theme as students designed for seasonal flooding, adaptive reuse along transportation corridors, and other underused spaces. In conversation with Enrica, I learned she used a similar methodology in previous studios and that the lens of optimism had little impact on how the design process unfolded. However, it was a very good moment to emphasize optimism of design to students and help them see a better future. Assistant Professor Twab Himley and sessional instructor Tanya Gortson chose Memorial Drive in Calgary as their site. It's a linear strip of land wedged between the Bow River and the inner city communities of Sunnyside and Hillhurst. Students had to reimagine a busy transportation corridor, a 4-lane arterial road for motor vehicles, and the banks of the river where there's a recreational trail for pedestrian and cyclists by incorporating flood protection. Instructors further challenged students by pushing them to address the selective memory of Memorial Drive, which largely pays homage to the fallen soldiers of World War I by addressing colonialism and the discovery of hundreds of unmarked Indigenous children's graves head on. Twab and other instructors reminded me during our conversations that the students' drawings are only part of the design process, that we ask students to check in on a regular basis, give oral feedback give and receive oral feedback from their peers and guest critics, and reflect and advance and to modify their designs. As professors, we too are reviewing our approaches to teaching and are constantly testing the limits of our own knowledge. In the ways in which we position ourselves in the classroom plays a role in the outcome of the student projects. I think my biggest takeaway from my conversation with Twab is that instructors are also putting themselves out there. And in many cases, we're learning alongside students as we navigate new directions and sometimes uncomfortable conversations. In addition to the reminders that students are learning from more than the sum of their final boards, I think it's worth pointing out that some studio instructors ask their students to build physical models. The tactile process is another way to learn about space. The materials we use to represent have short and long-term implications. And in this photograph, the construction materials all appear to be biodegradable. I think as instructors, we're leading studios that ask students to be conscious citizens, and there's an opportunity to reflect on the materials that we ask them to engage with alongside with the natural and social processes we ask them to design. So as a window into studio classes across the country, I think the optimism experiment demonstrates that instructors are looking for more equitable distribution of public space, opportunities to address climate concerns, invest in green infrastructure and social problems, and connect communities. I can't reiterate enough that this paper is a partial reflection on teaching and learning in landscape architecture, one that represents a small amount of the work that it takes to complete a studio project. In forming comparisons, we need to consider that students are at different stages of their education, and instructors are tailoring their approaches to teach and meet accreditation and program needs, as well as the stage of learning. Students are faced with problematics that respond to specific community needs, and they're working at many, many different scales. Instructors report that studio experiment did not change their approach to teaching or their research for that matter, yet it allowed them to engage with the landscape and each other in ways that some had never done before. For the most part, because of online learning, they were able to invite professors from one province into the critiques of another province at the midterm review. So in a sense, we're all building community through the experiment, along with learning that optimism is found in framing perceptions, preparing for the worst and hoping for the best, experiencing space with all 5 senses, knowing that it's okay to walk before you run, that it's really, that really great precedents make us smile, that it's okay to dream big, that politicians and NGOs can make good cheerleaders, that if we get lost, we should take out a map, and that there is much to be learned in humility, and that we need to practice what we teach. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Whitney Benton as well. And keep them doing the integration of sustainability with built environment and higher education.
I
think it's being done over there.
Oh,
Yeah, it might be. And are you loading it up?
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Eva. Thank you so much. Hi guys. Thanks for coming. I'm Whitney Bevan. I'm from RGU. I'm going to talk about integrated sustainability. Sorry.
No, sorry.
Just right now here. Integrated sustainability within built environment education. So where I teach.
you may have some points to ask.
Yeah. Sorry. Right. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. It was a small research project. Again from Chobe, Chair Heads Built Environment. I'm going to talk about why I need to do this research, or why I was driven to this research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the research, the aims, my literature before I dive into it. Then my data collection, my empirical work, key findings, and then how those key findings changed my practice, and is also still changing my practice. When I first did this last summer, a lot has changed in terms of I've actually put stuff in. Some stuff didn't work. Some stuff works, as you all know in teaching. So why this research? In terms of RGU, we're constantly talking about how we move from, in our built environment, architecture built environment, we're talking about how we move from having those modules on sustainable development. So I teach on a range of courses, and we have set modules, sustainable development. I taught on a module, sustainable construction practice, that's just your standalone. And what we really need to be doing, or what we're asked to be doing, is how we integrate that sustainable development within our other modules, which is the challenge. Then my experience as a practitioner, when I first started teaching the sustainable construction practices as a module, I forget that, and I taught to QSs, I forget that not every student is like me. I breathe sustainable practices, I breathe sustainability, I've done it forever, it's all I know within buildings. And I think when I started teaching the module, I had to change how I taught. I also had to go back to the real foundationals of sustainability, stuff that I talk about every single day. And I forget that we're not all looking at sustainable building materials. We need to go right back to that front part. There's a lot of theory in the literature. There's a lot of people that talks about what we need to be doing in order to really engage our students when talking about sustainability. The real bit which I love and I need is people that said, we've done it like this, it worked, or we tried this, it worked, it didn't work. That's what I love. There's not that, but there's a lot of, which is not bad, it's brilliant. There's a lot of, this is what we need to do. So that's my understanding and my reason for doing this. I've taken this quote from one of my interviews, and it basically says that we shouldn't be having this standalone course on sustainability. We should be thinking about it. And when people talk to me about, I teach risk management, maybe years and years ago, we need to think about how to integrate it in. But now it just becomes second nature. We know that we need to be with PPE. We don't need to be, educating our staff on it. And hopefully that is what sustainability will be like. I've used this picture. This is me. 10 years ago, maybe, I would go to a National Self-Build Renovation Centre probably once a month when I was doing my renewables course, back doing my MSc. I would see the technology. I would talk and ask the expert, say, how does this work? What were the challenges? And I need to remember how I learned, why I'm passionate about it, because I saw it. I use this picture because visibility comes into some of my findings. So the driver of it, education, sustainable development, the SDGs, they are the drivers of it. I've brought a little bit about what RGU want in terms of what they imagine education, sustainable development looks like within our courses, not just built environment, within all courses. They're also talking about doing a short course when students come in for every student on what education sustainable development is. It's way more than just your environment part. It's social, it's economic, it's empowering learners to make those decisions. So I've used a mix of those. So what I want to do in this research, in this small research project, I want to look at approaches that I could use to integrate sustainability within my modules, within my teaching. A lot of the theory talks about student-centered learning, talks about making students active players. How do I do that? Again, it's coming back to a lot of the theory that says we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to be, student-led actions, we need to be integrating that. What works, what doesn't? So a little bit on the literature. When I first started talking about this and just reading to improve my teaching practices, really, there's three main sections, I think. There's ones that says that if you go into integrate sustainability in your teaching, think about how to be innovative with your teaching practices. So your pedagogical practices. Talks about reflection on action, talks about trying to find the intrinsic motivation of the students, and touches upon a lot of these themes. Second part talks about perceptions, knowledge, and attitudes of practitioners. Just asking about the people that are teaching, what are their values, and what do they put in their assessment, and how much impact can they have on your students. And then this third one, so this is the one that there's not a lot in terms of how we do it, but this bottom-up approach, people talk about in that we need to be thinking about this bottom-up approach. And this bottom-up approach will help our students become active players. Again, there wasn't too much in terms of how I would go about a bottom-up approach in my university. So this is really the section that I'm interested in. Data collection, fun bit. Looked at secondary data collection, looked at a lot of literature in terms of what people said, what is education sustainable development. There's also a few other terms they throw around with it. But also what people have done in the classroom that works, doesn't work. Also, what this bottom-up approach actually is. And then my primary data collection, I did semi-structured interviews. So people within higher education, so actually asking other universities, what are you doing? What are you doing in the classroom? Also local authority. And then I was lucky enough to conduct 2 focus groups with my students to ask them, after I just taught them sustainable development in the module, to ask them what they thought about it, what they thought about what sustainability was, sustainable development. And that really helped to just get their perceptions as well. So some of the results. Thinking about understanding sustainability, a lot of my students talked about environmental sustainability. And that was absolutely me back 10 years ago. I was so focused on sustainability being environmental. I do see a lot of that in my students. But also we touched upon social, economic, and then some of my interviews talked about culture. They also said that sustainability was actually being considerate. And that does connect to what's in the literature. Many different ideas of sustainable development, as we know, of sustainability, and also education of sustainable development. Attitudes towards sustainable development or sustainability. And I think this was probably in my head, that top one at the left, when I started teaching it. A lot of people do say that there is a resistance to sustainable practices, education, sustainable development, and sustainability. I think that one of what has come through this research was actually students saying that we want to learn about it, which I love. Of course I do. But there's still a lot of people that talk about the fact there's this resistance to it. A lot of people also talk about the fact that it's difficult getting people to engage, and that is also what I found, especially with my QSs, my quantity surveyors, getting them to engage in wanting to learn about it. It might be not all our personal preferences. And also questions the importance of sustainability. That also come in one of my interviews where they said, there's a lot of people who questions why you want to study it, why you want to incorporate it. But the good bit is that engagement and attitudes are beginning to change. That's what a few of the interviewees said. We need to be thinking about motivations, sustainability, to study it. Maybe there's a personal level to it. A lot of my students, a strong desire to study sustainability. They connect it to employment, but they also connect it to, they want to know a personal understanding. You know, there was a conversation around what's in the news. More, we want to understand what's actually going on and how we can help. And then these are just a few of actions from my students. So responsibility, bounce back on us. Heard of sustainability, but I don't really know what it was. Didn't really know what it was before we started sustainable development, that module. And I wish I'd known more about that at school. Yeah. And then bottom-up approach, trying to find what this actually is, was probably my first challenge. And I asked my interviewees, what ideas would you get from a bottom-up approach if I was to incorporate within the classroom? A lot talked about real-world learning. One of my local authorities said something concrete. Real-world assessments from the literature. And then we came up, there was a few themes that came up within my 2 interviews. One of my students talked about knowing the theory, but not how to apply it to the job. And that really resonates with me. I want to be able to connect theory and practice. We all do in the classroom. So how can I do that? A few talked about, one interview in particular, I talked about embodied learning, experiential learning, allows the students to get away from their desk, and this visibility of a desire for visibility and practice came within my student focus group. So recommendations to practice, to understand what my students think about sustainability, I think is a great start, or was a great start. I think when I go back to that sustainable construction practices, if I had gone in and said to them, guys, what do we know about sustainability? You know, do we know to the nth degree? You know, like I talk about it every day. Have we heard of it? Do we think it's environmental? What do we think it is? What are your desires? Do you want to know about it? Do you want to learn about it? Is it a personal preference? Is it money? Is it employment? And then these visualization and also relate to practices. Since the research, I've asked the estates department to come in. So the next year that I ran the module, I've asked the estates to come in and actually talk about campus. So what is going on our campus? And since talking to our estates department, you know, we have a virtual campus, we have a number of different schools, and the estates manage energy, manage buildings. I was working at the university and I didn't realise that we actually had a graduate heat pump within our school. I didn't realise that we had solar panels on our rooftop. And then having estates to actually come in and talk to us, as I had 2 members. The one guy from estates, the energy manager, who was very much environmental. I think he was more sustainable than I tried to be. So he was very environmental. And then I had the other guy from estates to come in and talk about what they did on campus. And what was really interesting when they came in and spoke to my students a few weeks ago was that they not clashed so much, but there was that evaluation between the both of them. So, you know, the one was saying we need to do this, we need to do that. And then the other guy had his pragmatic hat on and said, well, actually, we can't do that because it's too expensive. And I think he talked about the PV, that if we had enough PV to supply electricity to the whole of campus, it would need to be 3 times the size of the campus. So there's that evaluation where I talk to my students and say that we can't do everything. I would love to put the technology on buildings, but not every building is going to need all that technology. It's going to, you know, it's going to be needs that evaluation. So they really showed that when I invited the states in. But also we've got the states doing all these things. Can I get my students to see them on a, you know, they're right under our nose. And I didn't realise that. So moving forward into my practice and also moving forward into my modules, what are estates doing that I can show students the real life, the reality, that practice meets theory. And then, you know, they're right on my doorstep. Incorporate a bottom-up approach into my practice. Allowing students to become active players, centred to learning, centred to their education. A few of these things, giving them a voice. So I've talked about bringing student ambassadors in. And actually we're doing a webinar on this. One of somebody from the audience said that we actually have student ambassadors for sustainability in our institution. Works really well. It gives them a voice. It gives them ownership of sustainability, which is great. Promoting their views and also encouraging debate in the classroom. And I've just used this from one of my interviews. The last thing which came across within the interviews was a connection to community. And two of my interviewees talked about there needs to be a connection to community. We need to be connecting community to our higher education institutions and also local government. But it was unanimous that we don't know how to do that. Or how do we do that? I think that's a question back to me. How would I do that? But they have a stake in things and we need to be making that connection. In terms of recommendations, I looked at a city studio example. It's used in the Netherlands, but we also used it in one of our modules at RGU, in one of our courses, where instead of giving students a case study, which is nothing new, giving them a case study of a building, what the city studio gets them to do is actually talk to the community and ask them what they want. What would you like to see here? What buildings you want? What infrastructure you want? How can we help you within the society? The difference between this is that there's a benefit to the community as well. So it's thinking about that equal benefit so it's not just me taking or my students taking or being. I think that before this study, I think I was very selfish and it's all about my students. I need that learning, but also how can I benefit the community as well? The city studio talks about co-design, so it's the two of them. They have a stake in it. Students feel they have ownership, they have empowerment, and I think that ownership empowerment runs straight through. If I think about, when we talk about climate change, sustainability, we see those overarching goal of, net zero emissions or zero emissions by 2045, Scotland or 2050. And it's quite broad. It seems like it's a huge target. And I think that sometimes, when I ask people about sustainability, we say that, what am I going to do recycling? What can I help? How can I help with my small part? And I think this is what it gives students, that ownership empowerment, because they can actually see what they do, or in terms of that case that they might take on that can help the community, they can actually see it being beneficial. And that really helps you to understand that you do make a difference. It might not be all to the environment. It might be that the community have a place to go to have lunch. It might be that they have go to have a place to meet. So I think this city studio example is something I'm going to try and integrate. I'm going to try and get a partnership between our community in Aberdeen and our students, where they can go and talk to them and ask them what they want and link it to sustainable development. And then quickly changes to my practice. I'm changing the way that I would talk, not completely, but in lectures, in my workshops. Instead of me saying, what is sustainability? I try to put the student at the center of it. So are you sustainable? Do you adopt sustainable practices? Does your future QS or project manager role incorporate sustainability? How do you do it? Making them involved in it, thinking, did you catch a bus today? Why did you catch a bus? Do you own a car? Do you bring a car today? What are the challenges around maybe cycling to university for you? Real world learning, not just focused on my assessments, but also then building the assessments instead of me handing out to project and describing it. And then bottom up approach to assessments, visibility, empowerment, and co-design, hopefully through that city studio. And then, so acknowledgements to Chobe for just giving me a small amount of research funding that actually said that, yes, this is a project that should be done. I think it's that confidence. And also I worked with Richard Lang, who was at RGU. And again, that initial proposal stage, when I said I'm having trouble with my teaching and helping me write that proposal, he was brilliant. And then probably everyone in my department who I talk about this all the time. So they put up with me doing that. Just for my references. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Whitney. Great. Next, we're going to invite Kevin Hoffman up. The session that we're gonna have is hands-off curricular coordination and instructor collaboration in the architectural thesis studio. And I believe Abby's gonna see that for you.
Okay,
On the other side, it's linked.
yeah, can you actually use the PDF instead of the PowerPoint? Thank you very much.
And do you have-
Okay, I'm gonna dual task here because my notes are on my laptop. Okay. It's great to talk to you this morning into afternoon. So what I'm going to talk about is really the story of a junior colleague inheriting classes from a senior faculty member and collaborating with him throughout the process as I joined both a new institution and a new place. But I want to, there we go. I want to start with a personal prologue. So I have a background in design, but also a formal background in education. And before I started teaching at the collegiate level, I was actually a high school teacher through a national service program called Teach for America. And so a lot of what I'm going to draw on today is taking a holistic look at my educational experiences and kind of instructor experiences, and trying to put that into a working theory about how thesis works. Professionally, I'm involved in conservation, design, build, preservation, and I've had a lot of experiences working with cultural institutions, which I think also drive what I want students to be thinking about in the thesis space. And also have worked to kind of democratize this. So a lot of the working theories you'll see today, I've implemented in OER resources for the National Endowment for Humanities. Oops, wrong way. Where are we going? Okay. So really, we're talking about two classes. They follow each other. So thesis definition and thesis development. And there's a photo of the institution where I work. So let's situate thesis as pedagogy for a second. And in order to do this, I want to kind of take a look at thesis as this bridge between, for many of our students, their whole life has been involved in schooling and employment, and to sort of problematize that for a second. So let's complicate things just a little bit, oops, and add, can't tell, yeah, just do that. We'll add kind of a word cloud to this to make some sense out of what we're thinking about. And so the darker the color, the earlier on this policy or theory is encountered in the whatever stage of life we're talking about. But there are a lot of ways that we can slice and dice this. So let's take a look at that. I'm not working with the clicker. So one way to do this is to think about local and global. So at the kind of local level, we see that some of these policies and theories light up. At the global level, others apply. But then if you look at the trend here, something I've noticed is that, you know, the local trend line starts to suggest that theories, so ideas themselves, concern the local individual throughout their earlier schooling, while their adult lives are largely dictated by observing professional policy and the enforcement of this, which is law. But conversely, the global trend dominates groupings of students in their early education, but your professional life often requires you to develop your own working theory about the ultimate meaning of labor and its true value. Another way to dice this up would be a storefront workshop. So, oops. You know, kind of on the storefront side of things, these are the interactions that happen with students. The workshop, this is the planning side of things. And for the storefront, this is really a kind of top down from theory to policy. So in the kind of classroom, the FaceTime we have with students, there's an understanding of theory which often leads to the adoption of policy. But in the workshop space, the vicissitudes of policy often drive the theories that ultimately make it to the table in the first place for discussion. Another way to look at this is fast, slow. So we can just sort of go through this. So thesis is actually really fast. I think a lot of students, even though a year-long project seems really daunting, this period of their life goes quite quickly, perhaps quicker than they can appreciate. But the rest of the experience can often appear really slow. So this is an evolution over time. And this is requiring of them to have some sort of intrinsic meaning for what they're doing. And the model of I do, you do, we do, and the kind of drudgery of school or professional life kind of bleeds together. And the intervals of schooling, semesters, academic cycles, I find that a lot of students have a hard time adjusting to professional life, which does not follow that unless you teach. Another way might be observational versus applied. So we can look at the things we have to observe versus the things we have to apply. And that this really starts to suggest that early learning is largely dictated by abundant policy, but we gain the agency to adopt our own working theories as we leave school. And then inversely, the professionalizing of education is something that we need to think about. And so implementing the standards that actually support social cognitive development and meets learners where they are and doesn't just prepare them exclusively for occupational success is really important, I find. And then lastly, let's look at formative and kind of summative assessments. So formative experiences, these are experiences that happen along the way. Summative experiences, this is really the kind of the roadblocks, the tests of that learning. And we find that, like the first pairing, formative has a sort of inverse relationship, and so does summative. Not working. There we go. So the thresholds of demonstrated competency are really important in the summative experience, and that these periodic assessments provide analytical data that, in the best of circumstances, can be used to actually feed back into the formative experience. And so this brings me to the point where we sort of think about what is the value added of thesis. And I would argue that thesis is really about seeking and not solving. And just as a kind of interlude here, you know, this idea of assessment cycle, or when we choose to gather data and how, I think it's important to sort of like remember that for our students, this looks, we kind of forget this when we get into the academic world, how quickly they are assessed. So some of those specific skills that happen in thesis are personal inquiry, argumentation, synthesis, reflection. And I think if we take these into account, we can actually start to think about how to shape our thesis classrooms. Because I have K through 12 experience, you know, I bring with me a kind of working theory about how I think learning should occur. And this comes from lots of different corners. We can talk about like the tools of teaching if we're talking about Joe Bowler, or we can talk about the social context of teaching if it's Delpit or Paulo Freire. In thesis, I have my students read a wide range of readings, everything from the kind of classic text by Ian Borden on the dissertation, David Gisson's Nature. I have them read kind of new practices and new ways of theorizing material consumption. And then I have them read things like, you know, the Communist Manifesto, just because it's a masterclass in argumentation. And then when they leave the thesis classroom and get employed, these are a lot of the texts that I think they'll be consulting on a regular basis. And so thinking about how are we going from these kind of theories of learning to the practicalities of professional life, I'm interested in that baton handoff and really trying to kind of fuse those learning or stages of their lives together, we could say. So if a lot of early education is about problem solving, And the value added of thesis is problem seeking. Maybe when they leave the thesis classroom, we are really teaching them to solve and seek others' problems. But I think by way of understanding this a little bit better, let's take a look at the comprehensive studio by contrast. So the comp studio, what's assessed here is really technical proficiency, conceptual integration. And I kind of have one distinction that these are really two discrete semesters. Teaching thesis, yeah, it's two different courses, but I really see that as a continuous experience. And so maybe if students meet us where they are as problem solvers, in Comp Studio, they become advanced problem solvers, and then they leave our classrooms being ready to solve others' advanced problems. So just to drive this home, if comp is really about technical knowledge and meeting the demands of professional practice, thesis is really an opportunity for them to pursue their own interests and ambitions. If comp is really where instructors shoulder most of the project research concerning program, location, technical requirements, what even defines success, thesis, by contrast, is an environment that demands that students identify what's relevant architecturally to them and then respond to it through argumentation, iteration, and visual communication. If comp is a summative experience, right, a distinct threshold that dictates a minimum proficiency, thesis is certainly a formative experience that, even after graduation, serves as a personal point of inquiry and a springboard. If comp encourages generalist approaches to very specialized problems, thesis, by contrast, encourages really specialized approaches to generalist problems. And because we're visual people, maybe it's helpful to think of thesis, right, as a tree, and I'm sorry, comp as a tree, and thesis as more of a rhizomatic structure. Maybe comp is a sort of toll booth and thesis is a bridge, but kind of like these infrastructural pieces, you can't really have one without the other, right? They work in concert, they work in tandem. So maybe it's not about paralleling these experiences, but it's really about kind of weaving them together. And if we think a little bit about what happens to students when they leave our programs, something that's really alarming to me as an educator is that 2/3 of the students that I teach in a professional degree program will not go on to become licensed architects or really even stay in the profession. And there's even like a whole kind of subculture of design born out of leaving architecture, which I find really alarming, but also kind of interesting because it's data that we can reflect on as educators. NAB, which is the United States accrediting body, between 2000 and 2015, there was a huge push to kind of have first professional degree earners go on to get licensed. And this was like the focus of redoing how you documented your work hours and what schools could provide for students. And with all those resources and efforts, it went up 4% in 15 years. And this was kind of heralded as a huge success. But my question for you would be, would we accept similarly low licensure rates for other professions like medicine, law? I would say no. And is it possible that the typical thesis studio, which is often run as a rite of passage, deters students from pursuing the profession of architecture? Or could it be that not offering a thesis studio, right, a chance to pursue your own personal interests, fails to ignite the passion that's required of students to actually thrive in a really demanding profession? So can thesis essentially be a catapult and not a barrier? I think it's important to kind of end actually with an epilogue about where I teach and context. So at Alfred State, 1 in 3 of the students that I teach are first-generation college students. A large majority of them come from in-state, even if that's, New York is quite a big state, but they're still in-state and that's what attracts them. It's overwhelmingly white, so we have a little bit of an identity and diversity crisis there, but it's extremely affordable. So that is something that really attracts students to us. And we have a decent graduation rate, but that's a little bit lower on the college-wide scale. So in architecture and the design disciplines, we have the ability to kind of raise that statistic, but not nearly as much as we'd like. Here we are. So we're located in the southern tier of New York, pretty far from the nearest cities, which is something that makes teaching design or architecture, which I think is fundamentally connected to culture, an interesting challenge, but also really rewarding intellectually. Another way to think about Alfred is actually part of the Appalachian region. So the Appalachian region spans 205,000 square miles from Mississippi to New York. The region extends through 13 states and consists of more than 25 million people, and 42% of those people live in rural areas. Most rural Appalachians demonstrate low educational attainment, with only 15.6 earning a 4-year college degree and 1/5 not completing their secondary education. Additionally, rural Appalachians earn well below the national average, with an average income of just $19,759. So these statistics make it really clear that there are systemic educational barriers for Appalachian youth. And those are a lot of the students that we serve at Alfred. Because I'm interested in geography and landscapes, I think it's also really important to remember that geographically, Alfred is on the other side of a distinct mountain range, which also reinforces this physical and cultural barrier to the east. So let's bring this home. Hey, this is an evolving method that's going to continue to change over time. Hands-off thesis classrooms, even though they appear to be very different in their in-classroom instruction, actually require a lot of collaboration behind the scenes, a handoff, if you will, that helps students progress their ideas with greater alacrity. And that this approach is particularly useful in rural and remote contexts, because we often have to make the most out of the least. We have modest resources, and we also have some serious staffing challenges too. So the bottom line, I find, is that future architects who are problem seekers and problem solvers will outperform their peers who may even possess greater technical proficiency. And not to have the last word, I'll sort of bring in two voices that I think can drive this conversation. We've got Haydek, who's kind of characteristically cryptic, but also not in what he's saying. So we make things well, we like to fabricate parts, and we like parts. So this idea that architecture is nothing if not techne, you know, the idea of making something, and that this is a poetic take on that, and that it's a bottom-up process, maybe problem solving. But Borden reminds us that the dissertation is architecture made of words. It's an arena in which to alternatively explain, explore, challenge, theorize, or imagine architecture. So this is really about problem seeking. And that's it. Thank you very much.